Sauron is the titular character of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In the same work, he is identified as the necromancer mentioned in Tolkien's earlier novel The Hobbit. In Tolkien's The Silmarillion, he is also described as the chief lieutenant of the first Dark Lord, Morgoth. Tolkien noted that the angelic powers of his constructed myth were capable of many degrees of error and failing, but by far the worst was the absolute satanic rebellion and evil of Morgoth and his satellite Sauron. Biography. Before creation of the world, the cosmological myth prefixed to the Silmarillion explains how the supreme being Ainur initiated his creation by bringing into being innumerable spirits, the offspring of his thought, who were with him before anything else had been made. The being later known as Sauron thus originated as an immortal spirit. In his origin, Sauron therefore perceived the Creator directly. As Tolkien noted, Sauron could not, of course, be a sincere atheist. Though one of the minor spirits created before the world, he knew Ainur, according to his measure. In the terminology of Tolkien's invented language of Quenya, these angelic spirits were called Ainur. Those who entered the physical world were called Valar, especially the most powerful ones. The lesser beings who entered the world, of whom Sauron was one, were called Mara. In Tolkien's letters, the author noted that Sauron was of course a divine person. Tolkien noted that he was of a far higher order than the Mara who later came to Middle-earth as the wizards Gandalf and Saruman. As created by Ainur, the Ainur were all good and uncorrupt, as Elrond stated in The Lord of the Rings, nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. Rebellion originated with the Valar Melk. According to a story meant as a parable of events beyond elvish comprehension, Ainur let his spirit children perform a great music, the music of the Ainur, developing a theme revealed by Ainur himself. For a while the cosmic choir made wondrous music, but then Melk tried to increase his own glory by weaving into his song thoughts and ideas that were not in accordance with the original theme. Straightway discord arose around him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent. But some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. The discord Melk created would have dire consequences. As this singing was a kind of template for the world, the evils of the world were not at first in the great theme, but entered with the discords of Melk. However, Sauron was not a beginner of discord. And he probably knew more of the music than did Melk, whose mind had always been filled with his own plans and devices. Apparently Sauron was not even one of the spirits that immediately began to attune their music to that of Melk, since it is noted elsewhere that his fall occurred later. The cosmic music now represented the conflict between good and evil. Finally, Ainur abruptly brought the song of creation to an end. To show the spirits, faithful or otherwise, what they had done, Ainur gave independent being to the now marred music. This resulted in the manifestation of the material world, a currency, where the drama of good and evil would play out and be resolved. First Age, entering a currency at the beginning of time, the Valar and Mara tried to build and organize the world according to the will of Ainur. Each Mara was associated with one of the powerful Valar whom they served. For example, Ossa, and Win, who were spirits of the sea, served Mo, the Lord of the Oceans. Sauron was prominent among the Mara who served Aulë the Smith, the great craftsman of the Valar. As a result, Sauron came to possess great knowledge of the physical substances of the world, forging, and all manner of craftsmanship, emerging as a great craftsman of the household of Aulë. Sauron would always retain the scientific knowledge he derived from the great Valar of craft. In his beginning he was of the Mara of Aulë, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. Sauron's original name was Mairon, but this name was changed to Sauron after he joined Melk. However, during the Second Age Sauron continued to call himself Tar Mairon. Sauron's fall, Melk opposed the other Valar, who remained faithful to Ainur and tried to carry out the Creator's designs. Within the larger universe, they eventually focused on developing the world of Arda. Around this time, Sauron fell victim to Melk's corrupting influence. In the beginning of Arda, Melk seduced him to his allegiance. As for Sauron's motives, Tolkien noted that it had been his virtue that he loved order and coordination, and disliked all confusion and wasteful friction. Thus it was the apparent will and power of Melk to effect his designs quickly and masterfully that had first attracted Sauron to him. For a while, Sauron apparently kept up the pretense that he was a faithful servant of the Valar, all the while feeding Melk information about their doings. Thus, when the Valar made ʻsaʊr̒n as their first physical abode in the world, Melk knew of all that was done. For even then he had secret friends and spies among the Mara whom he had converted to his cause, and of these the chief, as after became known, was Sauron. Melk soon destroyed ʻsaʊr̒n, and the Valar established a new abode in the uttermost west, the blessed realm of Valinor. They still did not perceive Sauron's treachery, for he too became a being of Valinor. At some point, Sauron left the blessed realm and went to Middle-earth, the central continent of Arda, where Melk had established his stronghold. In one text, Tolkien wrote of Sauron that in Valinor he had dwelt among the people of the gods, but their Morgoth had drawn him to evil and to his service. Sauron deserted his service to the Valar and openly joined their great enemy. Because of his admiration of strength he had become a follower of Morgoth and fell with him down into the depths of evil. The lieutenant of Melk, after joining his new master in Middle-earth, Sauron proved to be a devoted and capable servant. While Morgoth still stood, Sauron did not seek his own supremacy, but worked and schemed for another, desiring the triumph of Melk, whom in the beginning he had adored. He thus was often able to achieve things, first conceived by Melk, which his master did not or could not complete in the furious haste of his malice. In all the deeds of Melk the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part. In Chapter 3 of the Silmarillion, Tolkien writes that by the time the elves awoke in the world, Sauron had become Melk's lieutenant and was given command over the newly built stronghold of Angband. To protect the elves, the Valar made war on Melk and captured him, but could not find Sauron. Thus, when Melk was made captive, Sauron escaped and lay hid in Middle-earth. And it can in this way be understood how the breeding of the orcs went on with increasing speed. In the Blessed Realm, Melk feigned reform, but eventually escaped back to Middle-earth, holding the Silmarils of Far Anor. By then, Sauron had secretly repaired Angband for the help of his master when he returned. And there the dark places underground were already manned with hosts of the orcs before Melk came back at last, as Morgoth the Black Enemy. Shortly after the return of Morgoth, the Noldoran elves also left the blessed realm of Valinor in the uttermost west, against the council of the Valar, to wage war on Morgoth, who had stolen the Silmarils. In that war, Sauron served as Morgoth's chief lieutenant, surpassing all others in rank, such as Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs. Known as Gortr the Cruel, Sauron was at that time a master of illusions and shape-shifting. Werewolves and vampires were his servants, chief among them Draugluin, father of werewolves, and his vampire herald Thuringwethil. When Morgoth left Angband to corrupt the newly discovered men, Sauron directed the war against the elves. He conquered the elvish island of Tol Sirion and its watchtower Minas Tirith, so that it became known as Tol and Goroth, the Isle of Werewolves. 10 years later, Finrod Felagund, the king of Nargothrond and former lord of Tol Sirion, came there with Beren. He battled Sauron using sorcery but was defeated. Later, he died fighting a wolf in Sauron's dungeons to save Beren. Soon afterwards Lothian and Huon the Wolfhound arrived, hoping to rescue Beren. Sauron sent werewolves against them, but Huon slew them all. Aware of a prophecy to the effect that Huon would be killed by the greatest wolf ever, Sauron himself assumed a monstrous wolf-like form and attacked him. But the prophecy actually applied to the still unborn Karkaroth, and Sauron could not prevail against Huon, despite transforming into a serpent and his own form. Eventually, Huon had Sauron by the throat. Lothian gave Sauron two options: either surrender to her the magical control he had established over Tol and Goroth, or have his body destroyed so that his naked ghost would have to endure the scorn of Morgoth. Sauron yielded, and Huon let him go. Lothian destroyed the tower and rescued Beren from the dungeons. Sauron fled in the form of a huge vampiric bat, and spent some time as a vampire in the woods of Tau Nufuin. Nothing is told of his subsequent activities in the First Age until the end. Following the voyage of Acheron's Rendell to the Blessed Realm, the Valar finally moved against Morgoth. In the resulting War of Wrath, the Dark Lord was defeated and cast into the outer void beyond the world. But Sauron fled from the great battle and escaped. Chastened, Sauron assumed his most beautiful form and approached ๊NWA, emissary of the Valar, who nevertheless could not pardon a Maiar like himself. Through ๊NWA, Manwë as Lord of the Valar commanded Sauron to come before him for judgment, but he had left room for repentance and ultimate rehabilitation. Although Sauron's repentance before ๊NWA was genuine, if out of fear, he was ashamed to return to Valinor and receive a judgment or sentence due to his long service to Melk. Furthermore, the influence of his former master was still strong, so he escaped and hid in Middle-earth. Second Age, about 500 years into the Second Age, Sauron reappeared. Bereft of his lord, he fell into the folly of imitating him. Very slowly, beginning with fair motives, the reorganizing and rehabilitation of Middle-earth, neglected by the gods, he becomes a reincarnation of evil, and a thing lusting for complete power, eventually rising to become master and god of men. As for Sauron's fair motives, Tolkien emphasized that at this time he was not indeed wholly evil, not unless all reformers who want to hurry up with reconstruction and reorganization are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eat them up. Though the only real good in, or rational motive for, all this ordering and planning and organization was the good of all inhabitants of Arda, his plans, the idea coming from his own isolated mind, became the sole object of his will, and an end, the end, in itself. His capability of corrupting other minds, and even engaging their service, was a residue from the fact that his original desire for order had really envisaged the good estate of his subjects. The Rings of Power. As part of a plan to seduce the elves into his service, Sauron assumed a beautiful appearance as Ainur, Lord of Gifts, befriended the elven smiths of a region, led by Celebrimbor, and counseled them in arts and magic. Sauron hinted that he was an emissary of the Valar, specifically of Aulë, whom the Noldor exile held in high regard. Some of the elves distrusted him, especially Galadriel and Gil-galad, the High King of the Nold. The elves in a region, however, did not heed their warnings. With Sauron's assistance, the elven smiths forged the Rings of Power, which conferred great power upon their bearers. He then secretly forged the One Ring in the volcanic Mount Doom in Mordor. This One Ring to rule them all had the power to dominate the other rings and enslave their wearers to Sauron's will. The Rings of Power were extremely potent, however. To create an instrument that could dominate even them, Sauron was forced to transfer a great part of his native power into it. Yet while he wore it, his power on Earth was actually enhanced. Sauron's plan would have succeeded had the elves not detected his influence when he put on the One Ring. It was then the elves saw him for who he really was, removed their rings, and did not use them for as long as Sauron retained the One Ring. Enraged, Sauron initiated a great war and conquered much of the land west of Anduin. The three rings, however, had been forged by Celebrimbor himself without Sauron's help. These rings were saved and remained in the hands of the elves, specifically Gil-galad, Cárdan, and Galadriel. This began the Dark Years. Sauron overran a region, killed Celebrimbor, leader of the elven smiths, and seized the 7 and the 9 Rings of Power that had been previously forged with his assistance. Sauron besieged Imladris, battled Moria and Lothar-cubed Rhiann, and pushed further into Gil-galad's realm. The elves were hard-pressed to defend Lindon and the Havens, but in the nick of time the powerful army from Numenor arrived to their aid, defeating Sauron's forces and driving the remnant back to Mordor. The Numenor-cubed Rhianns were descended from the three houses of the Edain who helped the elves in their war against Morgoth. They lived on the island of Numenor in the seas between Middle-earth and Valinor, a reward for their service from the Valar, and theirs was the most powerful kingdom of men at this time. In Unfinished Tales, the history of Galadriel and Celeborn states that Sauron and his bodyguard were all that was left of his original army. Gil-galad's power after the war was such that Sauron was unable to move out of Mordor for some time. Resurgence from Mordor. From this time on, Sauron became known as the Dark Lord of Mordor. Sauron fortified Mordor and completed the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr, already centuries in the building. He distributed the remaining rings of the 7 and the 9 to lords of the dwarves and men. Dwarves proved too resilient to bend to his will, but the men were enslaved by Sauron as the Nazgûl, his most feared servants. Well aware of the strength of the Narmena-cubed rings after his earlier defeat, Sauron withdrew from the coasts and for a long time avoided directly challenging them, although he managed to use some of the 9 rings to snare 3 of their great lords. Sauron regained control over most of the creatures that had served Morgoth in the First Age. Sauron also gained power over most of the men in the east and the south, becoming their god-king. Toward the end of the Second Age, as the Narmena-cubed rings withdrew from the coasts after their people were divided by strife over the fear of death, Sauron began assailing their Middle-earth strongholds and assumed the titles of Lord of the Earth and King of Men. Destruction of Narmena. Toward the end of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn, who would turn out to be the last and most powerful of the Narmena-cubed ring kings, had just ascended to the throne when he was angered by reports of Sauron's increasing power. In a show of force, Ar-Pharazôn led a massive army to Middle-earth to reassert Narmena-cubed ring dominance. Sauron, realizing he could not defeat the Narmena-cubed rings with military strength, surrendered. Clad in a beautiful incarnation, he came to Ar-Pharazôn's camp to swear fealty to the king, and allowed himself to be taken as a prisoner to Narmena. This was part of his plan to corrupt Narmena-cubed ring civilization from inside. Sauron's personal surrender was voluntary and cunning. He got free transport to Narmena. When Ar-Pharazôn in his arrogance took Sauron hostage, he failed to realize with whom he was dealing. Sauron was of course a divine person, and thus far too powerful to be controlled in this way. He steadily got Ar-Pharazôn's sick mind under his own control, and in the event corrupted many of the Narmena-cubed rings. The Ākalabath, the account of the history of Narmena, does not specifically mention the One Ring much, and it has been suggested that Sauron left it at Barad-dûr before he became a hostage of Ar-Pharazôn. In his letters, however, Tolkien noted that Sauron naturally had the One Ring, and so very soon dominated the minds and wills of most of the Narmena-cubed rings. Through the power of the ring, Sauron soon became an advisor of the king, and he used his influence to undermine the religion of Narmena. He represented Eru as an invention of the Valar that they used to justify their decrees, and substituted the worship of Melk, with himself as high priest, for that of Eru. The worship of Melk, with human sacrifice, became mandatory in Narmena. But there was seen the effect of Melk upon Sauron. He spoke of Melk in Melk's own terms, as a god, or even as God. This may have been the residue of a state which was in a sense a shadow of good, the ability once in Sauron at least to admire or admit the superiority of a being other than himself. But it may be doubted whether even such a shadow of good was still sincerely operative in Sauron by that time. His cunning motive is probably best expressed thus. To wean one of the God-fearing from their allegiance, it is best to propound another unseen object of allegiance and another hope of benefits. Propound to him a lords who will sanction what he desires and not forbid it. Sauron, apparently a defeated rival for world power, now a mere hostage, can hardly propound himself. But as the former servant and disciple of Melk, the worship of Melk will raise him from hostage to high priest. Besides introducing the worship of Melk, Sauron also helped the people to design greater engines and amass more wealth, and soon the Narmena-cubed rings returned to Middle-earth where they cruelly hunted and enslaved the men there for eventual sacrifice. While Sauron ruled behind the scenes, Ar-Pharazôn became the mightiest tyrant in the world since Morgoth himself. Ar-Pharazôn, despite his power, eventually became fearful of his approaching death. Sauron convinced the king that he now had the status to take what was rightfully his, and suggested that the Narmena-cubed rings send a great armada upon Aman in order to seize immortality by force from the Valar. Sauron expected the Valar to respond by destroying Ar-Pharazôn and his naval might, thus removing Sauron's greatest obstacle to dominance of Middle-earth. But the Valar had no direct dominance over the children of Eru, so in the face of this challenge they laid down their guardianship of the world and appealed to Eru for a solution. Eru's divine intervention did indeed bury the king's armies and drown the armada. But Narmena itself was swallowed by the sea, and the Blessed Realm was removed from the physical world. Sauron had not foreseen this, and his body was destroyed in the destruction. Having expended much effort in the corruption of Numenor, he was diminished, particularly as he forever lost the ability to take a fair form. Yet his spirit rose out of the abyss, and he was able to carry with him the one thing that mattered most. Wrote Tolkien, "I do not think one need boggle at this spirit carrying off the One Ring, upon which his power of dominating minds now largely depended." In Aulë, Tolkien wrote that Sauron took up the ring after his spirit returned to Middle-earth. According to the Rings of Power in the Third Age, Sauron then realized that Gil-galad's power had grown great during his absence and now spread across the Misty Mountains and Greenwood the Great, drawing nigh to places that Sauron initially thought secure before leaving for Numenor. War against the Last Alliance, led by Elendil, 9 ships carrying the faithful Numenor were saved from the downfall and escaped the cataclysm. These Numenor exiles founded the kingdoms of Gondor and Ainur in Middle-earth. At first they believed that Sauron had perished in the downfall, but it soon became evident that the Dark Lord had returned to Mordor when Mount Doom erupted. The appendices in The Return of the King recount that while Sauron's power had not yet been fully rebuilt, he had decided to attack the Numenor before they could become too strong in their new realms. Sauron struck first, capturing Minas Ithil and destroying the White Tree, although Isildur managed to escape down the Anduin and seek Elendil, while Anarion defended Osgiliath and for a time drove Sauron's forces back to the mountains. In Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, and the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien wrote that Elendil and his sons forged the last alliance of elves and men with Gil-galad, as they realized that unless they united, Sauron would destroy them each individually. A great battle ensued between the alliance and the host of Sauron on the battle plain of Jalad. The alliance emerged victorious and invaded Mordor, laying siege to Barad-dûr for 7 years. Finally, Sauron was forced to emerge from his tower and fight against the Last Alliance himself. During the final challenge on the slopes of Mount Doom, Sauron was slain by Gil-galad and Elendil, who themselves perished in the act. When Elendil fell, his sword Narsil broke beneath him. Isildur, Elendil's surviving son, took up the hilt shard of Narsil and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. Then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places. Elrond and Caladan, Gil-galad's lieutenants, urged Isildur to destroy the ring by casting it into Mount Doom, but he refused and kept it for his own. "This I will have as a regald for my father's death, and my brother's. Was it not I that dealt the enemy his death blow?" Third Age, the traumatic loss of the ring greatly weakened Sauron. He spent the first 1,000 years of the Third Age as a shapeless, dormant evil. Nonetheless, his servants were involved in several events that gradually weakened the Numenor exile kingdoms, although it is unclear if Sauron was actively involved in directing them. A few years after the War of the Last Alliance, Isildur's army, marching to Rivendell, was ambushed and overwhelmed by a band of orcs in what became known as the Disaster of the Gladden Fields. Isildur put on the ring and attempted to escape by swimming across Anduin, but the ring which had a will of its own and a desire to return to Sauron slipped from his finger. He was spotted and killed by orc archers. The ring would remain lost beneath the water for thousands of years, with many believing there was no way Sauron could return, or that so long as the ring was lost Middle-earth was safe. The Necromancer of Dol Guldur, around the year 1050, a shadow of fear fell on the forest later called Mirkwood. As would later become known, this was the first sign of Sauron's remanifestation, but for many years he was not recognized. He was known as the Necromancer. He established a stronghold called Dol Guldur, Hill of Sorcery, in the southern part of the forest not far from ʻsaʊr̒n. Shortly after the shadow fell upon the forest, the Valar sent 5 men to oppose this growing power. They took the form of wizards, the most prominent being Gandalf and Saruman. By about 1100, the wise became aware that an evil power had made a stronghold at Dol Guldur. Initially it was assumed that this was one of the Nazgûl rather than Sauron himself. About the year 1300, the Nazgûl did indeed reappear. In the ensuing centuries, the chief of the Nazgûl, the Witch King of Angmar, repeatedly attacked the northern realm of Ainur, first in 1409 and finally overrunning and effectively destroying the realm in 1974. Though driven from the north in the following year by the elves and forces from Gondor, the Witch King retreated to Mordor and gathered the Nazgûl. In 2000, the Nazgûl issued from Mordor to besiege the city of Minas Ithil in the mountains bordering Mordor. The city fell in 2002, and became known as Minas Morgul. With the city the Nazgûl also captured the Palantir of Minas Ithil, one of the 7 seeing stones that Elendil's people had brought with them from Numenor at the eve of the downfall. In this same period, the dwarf kingdom in Moria was destroyed by a Balrog, who slew King Durin-6 and his son Nar-Inai and drove the dwarves away. In the centuries that followed, dragons attacked other settlements of dwarves in the north. In this time many of the surviving Noldorin elves became weary of Middle-earth and departed for Valinor. As the power of Dol Guldur grew, the wise came to suspect that the controlling force behind the Witch King and the other Nazgûl was indeed their original master, Sauron. In 2063, Gandalf went to Dol Guldur and made the first attempt to learn the truth, but Sauron retreated and hid in the east. It would be almost 400 years before he returned to his stronghold in Mirkwood, and his identity remained undetermined. Sauron finally reappeared with increased strength in 2460. About the same time, the long-lost ruling ring was finally recovered from the river Anduin, found by a Stewart hobbit named Dar Copyright Aggle. Dar Copyright Aggle's friend and relative Smar Copyright Aggle coveted the ring and killed Dar Copyright Aggle to get it, and was eventually corrupted by it, becoming the creature Gollum. Banished by his family, he took the ring, which he called his precious, and hid in the Misty Mountains. In 2850, Gandalf made a second attempt to spy out Dol Guldur. Stealing into the stronghold, he was finally able to confirm the identity of its lord. He reported this to the White Council of Elves and Wizards, but Saruman, hoping to acquire the One Ring for himself, dissuaded the council from acting against Sauron. Eventually, the wise put forth their might and drove Sauron from Mirkwood in 2941. During the White Council's delay he had, however, prepared his next move, and was willing to abandon Dol Guldur. Just before Sauron fled Dol Guldur, the hobbit Bilbo Baggins, on an improbable adventure with a party of dwarves, stumbled across the ring deep within the Misty Mountains. After his quest was over, Bilbo brought the ring back to Hobbiton in the Shire. Decades later, he passed it on to his heir, Frodo. By then, Sauron's power had recovered to the point that he was able to extend his will over Middle-earth. The Eye of Sauron, as his attention and force of will was perceived, became a symbol of oppression and fear. Following his expulsion from Dol Guldur, he returned to Mordor in 2942, openly declared himself 9 years later, and started raising Barad-dûr anew. In preparation for a final war against men and elves, he bred armies of monstrous orcs, known as Aurochs. The War of the Ring, the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings tell the story of Sauron's last attempt at achieving world dominion, as the Third Age reached its climax in the years 3018 and 3019. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf deduced that the Ring of Power that Bilbo had found in Gollum's cave was indeed Sauron's lost Master Ring. He informed Frodo about the true nature of the heirloom Bilbo had left for him, and its terrible potential if Sauron should ever regain it. The enemy still lacks one thing to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the One Ring. So he is seeking it, and all his thought is bent on it. Gandalf went for advice to Saruman, but discovered that he had been corrupted by his long studies of Sauron. Using the Palantir in the Tower of Orthanc, Saruman was now in communication with the Dark Lord and acted as his ally, though he also secretly hoped to gain the ring for himself and use its power to supplant Sauron. Gandalf was held captive atop Orthanc for a time, but soon escaped with the help of one of the giant eagles of Manwë. Having captured and tortured Gollum, Sauron learned that the ring had been found by a hobbit named Baggins. Sauron sent the Nazgûl to the Shire, Bilbo's home, but Bilbo had left years earlier. Frodo was likewise on his way out of the Shire. The Nazgûl pursued Frodo and his companions and nearly killed Frodo, but were defeated near Rivendell. In Rivendell, Elrond convened a high council of the peoples of Middle-earth to decide how to handle the crisis. The council determined that the ring must be destroyed where it was forged, since it was utterly impervious to any other flame than the volcanic fires at its place of making, Eredruin. Frodo and his friend Samwise Gamgee joined the Fellowship of the Ring, accepting the council's mission to cast it into the volcano. In the Two Towers, Saruman used his own army on Sauron's behalf and invaded Rohan. Gandalf, Thar copyright Odin king of Rohan, and the Ents, led by Trebeard, finally defeated Saruman's forces. His stronghold at Isengard was overthrown and Saruman left trapped within the Tower of Orthanc. Thus, one of Sauron's most powerful allies was neutralized. During Saruman's confrontation with Gandalf, the Palantir of Orthanc fell into the hands of the Fellowship. Gandalf handed it over to Aragorn, a direct descendant of Isildur and Elendil and hence the rightful owner of the stone. In The Return of the King, Aragorn used it to show himself to Sauron. Aragorn was leading Sauron to think that he now had the ring and was preparing to turn its power against its maker. The Dark Lord was troubled by this revelation, and therefore attacked sooner than he had planned by sending an army to overthrow Minas Tirith, capital of Gondor. Immediately after the huge army left Mordor through the pass of Cirith Ungol, Frodo and Sam attempted to enter the Black Land the same way. They had been previously met by Gollum, whom Sauron had earlier released from captivity while letting him think that he escaped by accident. For a while, Gollum had acted as a guide for Frodo and Sam. However, he finally betrayed them to Shelob, a monstrous, spider-like creature that guarded the pass. In the end, Sam drove off both Gollum and Shelob, but Frodo had been stung by Shelob and appeared to have died from her venom. The orcs found Frodo's body and stripped him of his gear, but Sam had already secured the ring. Frodo regained consciousness and was freed from the orcs by Sam, and the two started the grueling journey across the plains of Mordor towards Mount Doom. Aragorn marched on the Black Gate of Mordor with 7,000 men, intending to cause a diversion to draw Sauron's armies away while Frodo and Sam journeyed to Mount Doom. After a brief encounter with the mouth of Sauron, the battle was joined and went very poorly for the outnumbered Gondor-Rohan armies. Now wrongly convinced that Aragorn had the ring, Sauron apparently reacted just as Gandalf had thought he would: "I will crush him, and what he has taken in his insolence shall be mine again forever." Even as the captains of the West were about to be utterly defeated by the superior might of Sauron's grand armies, Frodo reached his goal, entering the fiery interior of Mount Doom. However, his pull failed at the last moment. Unable to resist the growing power of the ring, he put it on his finger and claimed it for his own. Sauron was instantly aware of him, and his gaze turned immediately to the door in the mountain. Recalling his remaining Nazgul from the ongoing battle, he commanded them to hasten to Mount Doom in a desperate attempt to secure the ring. It was too late, however. Gollum attacked Frodo, bit the ring from his finger, then lost his footing and fell with the ring into the fire. With a roar and a great confusion of noise, the One Ring perished along with all the power Sauron had invested in Gollum inadvertently achieving the quest after Frodo's failure. Tolkien later commented in one of his letters that Gollum's convenient slip was an immediate intervention by Eru himself. Gollum's fate was bound up with that of the ring, as Gandalf predicted in the Mines of Moria. At the ring's destruction, Sauron's power was immediately broken and his form in Middle-earth was destroyed. His departing spirit towered above Mordor like a black cloud, but was blown away by a powerful wind from the west. His vast empires collapsed, his armies lost heart, falling into confusion, and were easily overcome. The Dark Tower of Barad-dûr crumbled and the Nazgul were consumed in a hail of fire from the mountain as they flew towards it trying to save the ring. Sauron himself was crippled for all time. Thus, on March 25, Third Age 3019, the long reign of terror of the Second Dark Lord finally came to its end. Gandalf had predicted what the destruction of the ring would mean to Sauron: if it is destroyed, then he will fall, and his fall will be so low that none can foresee his arising ever again. For he will lose the best part of the strength that was native to him in his beginning, and all that was made or begun with that power will crumble, and he will be maimed forever, becoming a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. and so a great evil of this world will be removed. Names and titles. In some of Tolkien's notes, it is said that Sauron's original name was Myron or the Admirable, but this was altered after he was suborned by Melk. But he continued to call himself Myron the Admirable, or Tar Myron King Excellent, until after the downfall of Numenor. The name Sauron originates from the adjective saura foul, putrid in Tolkien's invented language of Quenya, and can be translated as the abhorred, or the abomination. In Sindarin he is called Gortor, the abhorred dread, or the dread abomination. He is also called the nameless enemy. The Dá and the Dain call him Sauron the Deceiver due to his role in the downfall of Numenor and the forging of the Rings of Power. In the Numenor cubed rune tongue he was also known as Zir-Gaar, the Wizard. His two most common titles, the Dark Lord of Mordor, and the Lord of the Rings, appear only a few times in the Lord of the Rings. His other titles or variants thereof include Base Master of Treachery, the Dark Lord, the Dark Power, Lord of Barad-dûr, the Red Eye, the Ringmaker, and the Sorcerer. In the First Age he was called the Lord of Werewolves of Tol Guldur. In the Second Age he assumed the name Anta, which means Lord of Gifts, and Orlendal, meaning Friend of Allah, as well as Artano, meaning High Smith, with which he assumed a new identity and tricked the elves into working with him to create the rings. In the Third Age he was known for a time as the Necromancer of Dol Guldur because his true identity was still unknown. Russian historian Alexander Nemirovsky suggests that the name Sauron is meaningful in the Hurrian language. He derives the name from the Hurrian sequence ʻsaʊrʒn, meaning possessing the weapon, or armed. Appearance. Nowhere does Tolkien provide a detailed description of Sauron's appearance during any of his incarnations. According to the Silmarillion, Sauron was initially able to change his appearance at will. In the beginning he assumed a beautiful form, but after switching his allegiance to Morgoth, he took a sinister shape. In the First Age, Gollum was at one point brought into the dreadful presence of Sauron, but the only concrete hint about his appearance is a reference to his daunting eyes. As part of a plan to destroy Huon, Sauron took the form of the greatest werewolf in Middle-earth's history. When the plan backfired, he assumed a serpent-like form, and finally changed back from monster to his own accustomed form. The implication is that his accustomed form was not, at least, overtly monstrous. It is understood to have been humanoid. Sauron took a beautiful appearance once again at the end of the First Age in an effort to charm a paragraph NWA, near the beginning of the Second Age when appearing as Anta to the elves, and again near the end of the Second Age when corrupting the men of Numenor. One version of the story describes, in general terms, the impression Sauron made on the Numenor cubed runes. He appeared as a man, or one in man's shape, but greater than any even of the race of Numenor in stature. And it seemed to men that Sauron was great, though they feared the light of his eyes. To many he appeared fair, to others terrible. But to some evil. Like Morgoth, Sauron eventually lost the ability to change his physical form. After the destruction of his fair form in the fall of Numenor, Sauron was unable to take a pleasing appearance or veil his power again. Thereafter, at the end of the Second Age and again in the Third, he always took the shape of a terrible Dark Lord. His first incarnation after the downfall of Numenor was extremely hideous, an image of malice and hatred made visible. Isildur recorded that Sauron's hand was black, and yet burned like fire. Gil-galad perished from Sauron's heat. In one of his letters Tolkien states that Sauron had a physical form in the Third Age. In a tale which allows the incarnation of great spirits in a physical and destructible form, their power must be far greater when actually physically present. Sauron should be thought of as very terrible. The form that he took was that of a man of more than human stature, but not gigantic. Tolkien's illustration of Sauron, J.R.R. Tolkien, artist and illustrator, includes a watercolor illustration of Sauron made by Tolkien himself. It appears to show a moment in the book occurring immediately after the destruction of the ring, when the armies of the West saw a towering, dark shape above Mordor, stretching out a threatening arm towards them before the figure dissolved. Since the illustration refers to a more or less visionary moment and is moreover highly sketchy, the image should not necessarily be pressed too hard for details about Sauron's appearance. The head, right arm and upper torso of an apparently humanoid figure are seen. The arm is black, the rest of the body is grey, except for a red eye. No other facial features can be made out. A series of spikes are visible on Sauron's head, possibly suggesting a crown. The mountains of Mordor are seen under the outstretched arm, confirming the enormous size of Sauron's final apparition. Eye of Sauron. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, the eye is the image most often associated with Sauron. Sauron's orcs bore the symbol of the eye on their helmets and shields, and referred to him as the Eye, because he did not allow his name to be written or spoken, according to Aragorn. Also, the Lord of the Nazgul threatened a Permil Owen with torture before the lidless eye at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Frodo had a vision of the eye in the Mirror of Galadriel. The eye was rimmed with fire, but was itself glazed, yellow as a cat's, watchful and intent, and the black slit of its pupil opened on a pit, a window into nothing. Later, Tolkien writes as if Frodo and Sam really glimpsed the eye directly. The mist surrounding Barad-dûr are briefly withdrawn, and one moment only it stared out. As from some great window immeasurably high there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye. The eye was not turned on them, it was gazing north. But Frodo at that dreadful glimpse fell as one stricken mortally. This raises the question of whether an eye was Sauron's actual manifestation, or whether he had a body beyond the eye. Gollum tells Frodo that Sauron has, at least, a black hand with 4 fingers. The missing finger was cut off when Isildur took the ring, and the finger was still missing when Sauron reappeared centuries later. Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion that the Eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure even before his body was lost in the War of the Last Alliance. In the draft text of the climactic moments of The Lord of the Rings, the eye stands for Sauron's very person, with emotions and thoughts. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, Frodo, the eye piercing all shadows. Its wrath blazed like a sudden flame and its fear was like a great black smoke, for it knew its deadly peril, the thread upon which hung its doom. Its thought was now bent with all its overwhelming force upon the mountain. Christopher Tolkien comments, the passage is notable in showing the degree to which my father had come to identify the Eye of Barad-dûr with the mind and will of Sauron, so that he could speak of its wrath, its fear, its thought. In the second text, he shifted from its to his as he wrote out the passage anew. Most adaptations of the story to visual media depict the eye as visibly present. For obviously the Eye of Fire is visually effective, whereas references to Sauron's never-seen body are so few that even readers of the novel often overlook them. Peter Jackson's movie adaptation depicts the Eye of Sauron as the all-seeing eye conducting mass surveillance, with the prequel adaptation presenting the eye as an extending aura with Sauron's spiritual essence serving as the iris. Concept and creation. Since the earliest versions of the Silmarillion legendarium as detailed in the History of Middle-earth series, Sauron underwent many changes. The prototype or precursor Sauron figure was a giant monstrous cat, the Prince of Cats. Called Tvildo, Tifil and Tybeth among other names, this character played the role later taken by Sauron in the earliest version of the story of Beren and Tina-Viel in the Book of Lost Tales. The Prince of Cats was later replaced by Thar, the Necromancer. The name was then changed to Gawther, Zar, and finally to Sauron. Gawther, in the form Gawtr, remained in the Silmarillion. Both Thar and Sauron name the character in the Lay of Lithien. The story of Beren and Lithien also features the heroic Hound Huan and involved the subtext of cats versus dogs in its earliest form. Later the cats were changed to wolves or werewolves, with the Sauron figure becoming the Lord of Werewolves. Prior to the publication of the Silmarillion, Sauron's origins and true identity were unclear to those without full access to Tolkien's notes. In early editions of Robert Foster's The Complete Guide to Middle-earth, Sauron is described as probably of the Eldar Elves. Yet there were other critics who essentially hit the mark. As early as 1967, W. H. Auden conjectured that Sauron might have been of Valar, long before it became known that Tolkien had indeed described him as a lesser member of the race of Valar. Adaptations. In film versions of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron has been portrayed as either a human-like creature or a physical, disembodied eye, or both. This last option is shown in the 2001 to 2003 film trilogy directed by Peter Jackson. Here, Sauron is shown to have a large, human-like form during the forging of the ring and up to his losing it, then being limited to the disembodied eye form throughout the rest of the storyline. Though the 1978 animated film and the 2001 live-action film both contain a prologue featuring the forging of the Rings of Power, the War of the Elves and Sauron goes unmentioned and the films jump straight to the much later War of the Last Alliance. In both, Sauron does not have the form he wore as Ainur, when he forges the One Ring, but rather the one reflecting his identity as Dark Lord, and he is defeated by Isildur alone. In Jackson's series, Sauron is originally portrayed as a towering black knight wielding a huge black mace. In this form, he is portrayed by Sala Baker. Sauron's armor is brutal, spiky, but of very high quality. It has very ornate filigree but is also quite functional. In the DVD commentary, the production team explained their intent was to represent Sauron's great skill as a craftsman and ring maker. Sauron was originally a Maya spirit in service to the smith Aulë, and thus was very wise in the lore of physical construction. Sauron may have fallen from his previously angelic state, but a shadow of his great skill in forging and construction remains, even though it has been twisted to making weapons of war. Thus they chose to depict Sauron as wearing frightening, but very high quality and ornate armor of his own creation. This body disintegrates with explosive force after Isildur cuts off the ring with the hilt shard of the sword Narsil. After this defeat, he is thereafter portrayed as the Eye, which is presented as an actual physical manifestation. Sauron is voiced by Alan Howard. Later in the first film, Saruman remarks that Sauron cannot yet take physical form, so the audience is apparently to assume that the flaming eye of Sauron is his disembodied spirit. This eye hovers between the twin horn-like spires above Barad-dûr. In the novel, Sauron was inside the tower, gazing out through the window of the iron, his shadow-mantled fortress. In the extended edition of The Return of the King, Sauron's humanoid form appears when Aragorn looks into the Palantir. In interviews, Jackson repeatedly refers to Sauron as just a giant floating eyeball. In the novel, even if one interprets the text as saying that the eye exists physically, it is never clear whether it is disembodied or not. In the Jackson films, Sauron wears plate armor, but the author nowhere specifically discusses what kind of armor Sauron may have worn during his physical incarnations. According to Saruman in the first film, the Eye of Sauron sees Aulë, though this is somewhat clarified in the third film. Here, the Eye of Sauron is shown scanning Mordor rather like a searchlight, and can only observe one location at a time. The effect in Mordor is seen as a red beam that moves across the land, forever probing. A later statement regarding Sauron's observational powers shows they are akin to the novel, as Gollum says at one point that Sauron can see everything, but he cannot see everything all at once. It also seems to be visible to Frodo any time that he is wearing the ring. Pippin has a brief encounter with the Eye, after gazing into the Palantir of Orthanc. In the book, Pippin indicates that he somehow perceived Sauron, but it is not made clear exactly what he saw, whether the Eye or some other manifestation of the Dark Lord. The Dark Tower crumbles with the destruction of the ring, and as it does so the Eye appears to turn more yellow and the dark clouds of Mordor swirl in around it before finally being wiped from existence with a final massive explosive force, which in turn destroys anything under the control of Sauron. In earlier versions of Jackson's script, Sauron would indeed come forth at Aragorn's challenge, and do battle with him. The extra materials published together with the extended DVD version of the third movie indicate as much. Scenes of the fight were shot, but later this idea was discarded and was replaced by a scene where Aragorn kills the mouth of Sauron before fighting a Mordor troll. In fact, the footage of the battle with the troll was the same footage of Aragorn fighting Sauron, with the CGI troll mapped over a painted-out Sauron, as seen in the DVD special features. In this abandoned scene, when Sauron first emerges from the Black Gate, he appears in his fair and seductive form as Ainur the Lord of Gifts, trying to entice Aragorn and the other leaders with offers of peace and dominion. When they reject him, the image fades and he appears as the armored Sauron from the prologue. Jackson said he removed the scene when he realized it was too much of a departure from the source material and thematically missed the point. The battle was supposed to be a selfless sacrifice by Aragorn and his army, and making it into a duel between Aragorn and Sauron made it more about personal glory. Sauron appears as the Necromancer in Peter Jackson's The Hobbit film Adaptations, where he is portrayed through voice and motion capture by Benedict Cumberbatch. As a shadowy humanoid, the Necromancer appears briefly in the first film when Radagast the Brown enters Dol Guldur. In the second film, Jackson moves Gandalf's decisive expedition to Dol Guldur forward in time to coincide with the quest of Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves in 2941. The Necromancer is shown as an amorphous entity of shadowy mist floating around in the ruins. Only when Gandalf confronts him is Sauron's form partially consolidated as a glowing, armored figure before the entity reforms into the Eye of Sauron to subdue the wizard. Sauron appears in merchandise of the Jackson films, including computer and video games. These include The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth 2, The Lord of the Rings, Tactics and The Lord of the Rings, The Third Age. Sauron also appears as a playable character in the game, The Lord of the Rings, Conquest. He is also a playable character in LEGO The Lord of the Rings. Allusions in other works: The Eye of Sauron is mentioned in The Stand, a post-apocalyptic novel written by Stephen King. The villain Randall Flagg possesses an astral body in the form of an eye akin to the lidless eye. The novel itself was conceived by King as a fantasy epic like The Lord of the Rings, only with an American setting. The eye is also used in the Dark Tower series as the sigil of the Crimson King, an analogous figure in King's mythos. The Eye of Sauron appears as a visual reference in the Waking the Dead episode Double Bind. In S.M. Sterling's Emberverse series, the Eye of Sauron is the emblem of one of the new polities arising in the wake of the change. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Junot Diaz repeatedly characterizes Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo as our Sauron. Multiple references appear throughout the novel. In the Marvel Comics universe, the supervillain Sauron, an enemy of the X-Men, names himself after the Tolkien character. In the comic series Fables, by Bill Willingham, one of the major antagonists is called the Adversary, a disambiguous figure of immense evil and power believed to be responsible for much of the misfortune in the Fable's overall history. Willingham has stated the Adversary, in name and in character, was inspired by Sauron. See also Akalaba Th, Dagobah or the Rings of Power and the Third Age, Morgoth, War of the Ring, Notes. References. External links: Sauron at the Internet Movie Database, Sauron at the Tolkien Gateway, Sauron at the Encyclopedia of Arda, Sauron at the Thanes Book, Sauron at the Ardapedia.